Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir begrüßen Sie ganz herzlich zum 10. Termin unserer Ringvorlesung China gestern, heute, morgen. Ich freue mich schon das ganze Semester auf den heutigen Abend für die heutige Podiumsdiskussion. We are very pleased that we could win Mr. Frank Sieren as a moderator and Mrs. Solange Gouard-Chatelard, Dr. Stacy Links and Mr. Georg Lammich as experts on the topic of today's China lecture, China and the Future of Africa. I would like to give a, I would like to give a short introduction to our panelists. Solange Gouard-Chatelard is Research Associate at the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium. She has worked and published on rural development and everyday state formation in China and more recently turned her attention to contemporary Chinese relations with Africa. Since 2008, she has focused on new Chinese migration to Africa through the case study of Zambia in southern Africa, based on a long-term ethnography fieldwork carried out in Zambia between 2008 and 2013. She helped establish the world's largest international academic network on China-Africa affairs, the Chinese and in Africa, Africans in China Research Network, and currently serves as a member of its executive board. In addition to her research, she has also produced 2 film documentaries about China's growing presence in Africa. One is When China Met Africa for the BBC and King Cobra and the Dragon for Al Jazeera. Welcome, Solange Gouard-Chatelard. Dr. Stacy Links is a researcher whose work is focused on the nexus of critical international relations, critical human rights, scholarship and development. Her research in her PhD trajectory focused specifically on human rights dimensions of Sino-African relations. Her approach to international relations is informed by post-colonial and decolonial insights, both of which often go untouched in international relations, scholarship and practice. Prior to the completion of her doctoral research, Dr. Links worked in the field of human rights and development in South Africa, Ghana, Senegal, Haiti, and The Hague. Welcome, Stacy. So, Georg Lammich is an associated researcher in the international relations and African politics at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Duisburg-Essen and holds a diploma in East Asian Studies. His research focuses on interregionalism and China's impact on regional integration, development and security in Africa. He has been a visiting research fellow at the Center for Chinese Studies in Stellenbosch, South Africa, and has conducted extensive fieldwork in China and various countries across the African continent. Welcome, Georg. According to the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit, Frank Sieren is, quote, one of the leading German China experts, end of quote. He wrote for Süddeutsche Zeitung, Wirtschaftswoche, Die Zeit and the Handelsblatt about China. No other German journalist has published more books about China than he did. In addition, Sieren has authored many TV documentations for ARD and ZDF. He has lived more than 25 years in Beijing. His bestseller, Der Afrika-Boom, was published in 2015 and his most recent work is Zukunft, China. Unfortunately, due to fire protection regulations, we are not allowed to set up a book table in this building, but all of Frank Sieren's books are available in every well-stocked bookstore.
Is this true? Can't be true.
One more word to the procedure of our panel. First of all, the panelists will give a short introduction to their specific research interest. After that, we will have roughly 15 minutes of discussion and 15 minutes of question and answer at the end. We once again warmly welcome our panelists. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot for this very nice introduction. I know this is according to plan. I should tell you why I'm interested in Africa, because I'm living in China for about 25 years. Actually, I'm interested in Africa very much because of personal reason. My wife, a British wife, she grew up in Africa until she was 10, 12 years old. She lived in Kenya, and my brother lives in Johannesburg. And so I'm traveling to Africa since quite a time, at least once a year. And then I started, about 10 years ago, I started to do a documentary on China-Africa, which was the first TV documentary on this topic. And later I wrote a book together with my brother on the African development and the Chinese role. And if I would be bored by China, which is not yet the case, I would immediately move to Africa. I think now you guys have a short presentation, and probably you, Solange, you just start.
Great. Well, I'd first like to thank all the organizers for inviting such a distinguished panel. It's really an honor to be here and to share some of our research with you. I work in Zambia. I've been working in Zambia in southern Africa for the last 11 years. Rather than sort of speak about myself, I really want to show you a few slides, a few images, to give you an idea about sort of what we're talking about. If this conference is about, China and Africa's future, I think it's important to understand the history, the past as well. So I'd like to start, hopefully this works, with a map of old Beijing. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Beijing as a city. If you look at it, this is kind of old Beijing. And it's built around concentric circles, which still structure the city more or less. And the story I'm going to tell you is it's a true story of a French diplomat who took up his first mission in Beijing in the early 60s, just at the cusp of the Cultural Revolution in China. He went on to become a French ambassador in China and had a great career in the foreign service. But what I'm interested in is telling you what he saw when he came to Beijing in the early 60s. The foreign embassies, European and imperial embassies in Beijing used to be situated right outside Tiananmen Square. So if you look at, this is where the emperor resided. That's the Forbidden City. The inner city around him is essentially composed of places members who serviced the emperor. And then the inner city, the imperial city, is the one, of course, who serviced the emperor. The inner city is then the bigger city, protected by a very large wall, as you see, surrounded by huge gates, and then the outer city. So if you had arrived as a diplomat, a French or a German or Austro-Hungarian or Italian diplomat at the start of the 20th century, your embassy would have been here, just outside of Tiananmen Square, so strategically located at the doors of the Emperor's Gate. And what happened after 1949, after the Communist Revolution, was that they moved this imperial compound called the European Legation Quarter. So you had the Russians, the Americans, the Japanese, and that moved after 1949 to two different places. One place was here, around the Temple of the Sun, Zhitangongyuan, in what is now Jianguomen, and there they established a diplomatic compound for all the friends of the socialist camp. So Vietnam, Korea, Mongolia, Poland, Romania, that was all the countries belonging here. And they opened another diplomatic camp outside, just slightly further north here, outside of Dongzhimen, which was situated 3 lees away. Li is a measure word, a bit like a kilometer in the West, and that became San Li Tun, 3 lees away. And that was a diplomatic quarter for all the newly independent countries, like Congo, Mali, Morocco, etc. And it was here where the new French diplomat, took up his position at the French embassy, which is essentially, he was sandwiched between the new embassy of Syria, which had basically been under French tutelage, and between Equatorial New Guinea. So the reason I'm giving you this story is really a couple of takeaways. The first takeaway is that the Chinese have always been interested in what's been happening beyond its borders, and particularly with Western empires. So it's not a new item of interest on China's agenda. They understand geography, they understand the geography, the power behind geography, and so they've understood the importance of acknowledging these new countries emerging into the fold throughout the period of decolonization. I'm not going to go into the details, but this is one of the big gates that you would have seen. All this has been taken down now in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution. And I'm not going to go into this, but China played a major role and have had a major push into Africa in the 1960s for various strategic reasons, essentially for strategic survival against a competition with Taiwan and a competition against Soviet Russia, but I'm not going to go into that right now. The point is that China's been interested in the continent for a very long time, and this story allows you also to contextualize the role of Europe, where China actually situates Europe, in a broader perspective of geopolitical competition. So what's happened today essentially is a return to the continent and not an arrival of Chinese interest. And the problem with the way the story is being told today is that we're really stuck in between two polar opposites. The first side is paranoia, and generally summed up by this image. The idea is that China's coming in, it's the neo-colonial trope. They're buying everything, they're grabbing the land, they're conquering, they're trapping countries into unsustainable debt. And this is kind of the image that really sums up this trope. The next side of the debate is propaganda. So on the opposite side of paranoia is propaganda, and that's really the image that is being pumped out of Beijing today, which is about friendship, third world solidarity, these anti-imperial legacies, which brings these countries together, in China that's really going to help Africa recover and get on its feet and get going and be part of the modernization project. So I think beyond these two very polarizing stories, very polarizing narratives, which have more or less framed the entire China-Africa debate, I think there are actual facts and concrete dynamics and forces that are taking place. And this is the last slide, and these are the real points that I'd like you to remember, if there are a few takeaways, is that fundamentally, China's had two periods of reform, if you like, since Mao's era. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Chinese history and the history of Chinese economy, but essentially, China has now spent 4 decades in a market economy and 3 decades in a centrally planned economy. So under the Communist Party leadership, China has spent more time as a market-driven economy than a centrally planned one. And that's very important. And the first period of reform began with Deng Xiaoping, and that ended, and a new period has begun now under Xi Jinping, which is in the mid-10s. And it is essentially, I would argue, this period of what we call deep market reform that is really sort of pushing a lot of China's business, a lot of China's economic interest, a lot of China's soft strategic agenda outside of its borders. So what we're seeing is kind of not only China's push into Africa, but China's push into Central Asia, Latin America, the whole what we call the Belt and Road Initiative is really, it's not just a story about China asserting its power outside of its borders. It's not really a question of China feeling like it's, a new hegemon on the rise. I think it's also very much linked to a recentering and a restructuring of domestic issues, economic, political, and social back home. But the story of markets is very, very important, and I'd like you to bear that in mind because it gives you a different story. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of Xi Jinping's signature project, is very much a hybrid project. It's not so much a top-down government investments out of the borders. We have a lot of private companies going in. We have a lot of private migrants going in. The story is much more complicated than that. So that's kind of the point I'd like to stress. And finally, bear in mind that you're talking about a government under strain. And both sides are under strain. The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, behind this facade of strength and power and cohesion, is under a lot of strain domestically, and I think so are the countries that it's cooperating with. So, countries that I work in, in Zambia, for example, these are fragile institutions with a lot of internal contradictions, navigating very, very complex context. So, just bear in mind that you have to think, remember these contradictions, these tensions within these two contexts. So, I think I'll leave it at that.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Georg, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for having me. I will talk a bit about my research, which is actually my PhD research, which I just submitted yesterday. So it's like a concluded project. And most people, when they talk about China, Africa, what they actually mean is China, Nigeria, China, Ethiopia. So they're talking about bilateral relations, and they frame that in this context of China, Africa. So what I was looking at was like the regional dimension. So mostly I focused on the African Union. When we look at There's a slide? No, there we go. When we look at FOCAC, which we'll, I'm sure, hear about more in the discussion, this is a forum of Chinese-African cooperation, which is the main instrument for Chinese-African dialogue. It started off in the year 2000 as like a bilateral forum. So China was bilateral, the African countries were also happy engaging on a bilateral basis with China, so one country. And China was in the first years just recognizing that there are some, that there's some stuff happening on a regional level in Africa. Because the African Union just got founded, the predecessor, the OAU, didn't really work out. So they were very hesitant. Also on a global scale, they didn't really engage in regional organizations. They thought they're all like agents of the US and things like that. So and this changed in the last years. And I think the 2006, the China-African policy got published, and that was the first time China actually not just recognized the African Union, but also said, okay, we're going to support the African Union. And since then, it has developed to quite a stable relationship on many different levels. I mean, some of you might have heard that the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa is built by the Chinese, was built by the Chinese. It's now the biggest building in Ethiopia. So this is the symbolism of all this relationship, but since then that was done in 2014. A lot of other things have happened, and the African Union now has a permanent representative office in Beijing, which is also for the African Union kind of a first to have that in a country. So on a country base, China is one of the most important partners of the African Union. But if we look at this relationship, it's kind of a very asymmetrical relationship. We have a very strong nation country with a very coherent African policy, strategy, money on the one side, and we have the African Union. And the African Union is, they don't have a China policy, they don't have really a lot of international capabilities, they don't really know how to deal with other countries outside of Africa because they've never really done that. So this is very complex, but it's a PhD thesis, so sorry, there has to be a lot of theory and diagrams and graphs. But what basically, when we look at this relationship, I was interested what happened at the African Union. What are the effects for the African Union? And this is all what we see on the bottom. Because all these big international functions that are like going global, that has systemic effects, that are like, for instance, when the European Union is dealing with the US, it always goes on systemic global governance, things like that. But in this relationship, most things happened on an internal basis, were effects that happened for the African Union. And I sum that up in like peace and security, development in Africa, in the African Union, so regional development, regional peace and security processes were affected by China. And yeah, this is basically what I was looking at the last couple of years. But I think in the discussion we also will touch a lot of different topics. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks a lot. Stacey, it's your turn.
Hi, thanks again for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be able to sit with these very intelligent people around me. So, yes, that's my name. So I focus on human rights and international relations. And specifically in the last 4 or 5 years, I have focused on critical international relations, critical human rights studies, and I myself am from South Africa, so I've always been interested in African issues, but I focus specifically on the human rights dimension of China-Africa issues. For those of you who are familiar with the kind of field of China-Africa studies, a lot of it is to do with unpacking myths and demystifying what actually happens in China-Africa relations. And we see this demystifying in economics, in political spheres, all kinds of aspects. And the one aspect that doesn't really get talked about much, or researched much, I would say, is human rights. And human rights has kind of always been left to a footnote, and it's kind of been treated as a fact. And this fact, which I put in quotations here, is based on this assumption that Sino-African relationships are detrimental to human rights in Africa, or that they just don't consider human rights. Human rights doesn't form part of these relations. So I, in my research, really wanted to look at the discrepancies of this kind of dominant narrative that you see, especially external to the relationship, and kind of look at how this plays out in the context of China-Africa relations. I did a very wordy, so I didn't have nice diagrams like George over here. I had a lot of words in my PhD dissertation, and I did a critical discourse analysis. So basically I looked at representations of three main issues: the representations of human rights, the representations of the nature of the relationship, and the representations of the actors involved. And I looked at these representations vis-a-vis international human rights. And international human rights I took as the International Bill of Rights. And what came out is that the dominant narrative is that China-Africa relations are seen as problematic when it comes to human rights because they diverge from the Western norm. The West within this discourse is seen as the benchmark for how human rights should be treated in international relations. One of the main issues, and you've probably heard about this, is that China-Africa relations are measured on this notion of there's no conditionality. And because this conditionality is absent, it's assumed that human rights don't play a part in this relationship. One of the big things that came out of my research is basically the narrative holds that if it doesn't look like the Western model, then it cannot be protecting human rights. My questions regarding this was, what have the successes been of this Western model? And is this Western model truly universal, or is it actually a particular kind of model? Some of the issues, I'll go through these very briefly. I think the main thing that I want you to maybe take out of this slide is that one of the asymmetries that we see in the way that human rights are discussed in China-Africa relations from an external perspective is that rights such as the right to development are basically completely ignored. And within the international human rights framework, it's important to understand that the right to development is an equal, fundamental, and inalienable human right. So this emphasis on the right to development is not to the exclusion of civil and political rights, but it is as equal as any other right. Then, as I said, conditionality is seen as the quintessential method within international relations of protecting human rights. But the question remains, is it effective? One thing that I argue within my research is that conditionality, we need to understand and need to remember, is a policy choice, and it's not an absolute. Conditionality, I know a lot of the times China-Africa relations and China in Africa gets targeted as neo-colonial, but we should remember that with conditional kind of approaches that the West has used for a very long time, a lot of times these are seen as civilizing missions within Africa. So it can be quite ironic that within this discourse, China is touted as a neo-colonial force within Africa. So do Sino-Africa relations actually, what do they say on human rights? My conclusion, like most PhDs, is that it's open for debate. One thing that I do argue is that China is contributing inadvertently to human rights by focusing on rights such as the right to development, whether that is done in an express way, in a very obvious kind of, policy-oriented way is a question for discussion. But to a certain degree, China-Africa relations is contributing to human rights, and I welcome lots and lots and lots of questions on that. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for these short introductions, and let's start with the big question. We learned already that China and Africa are kind of well organized for quite a long time, for about 20 years now, and they have a relationship which is getting closer and closer. We probably would agree on that. And the question is this good for China and is it good for Africa? If you have to generalize before we go into detail.
I will just jump the gun there and I'll say yes. Do I need to explain why?
Yes, please.
Oh, gosh.
We still have some time.
Okay, I would say yes. From my perspective and from the research that I've done in the human rights perspective, although it might seem very contrary to what the dominant discourse would have it, I would say that it is a positive development. I think this relationship has opened up a lot of doors for Africa, a lot of doors to assert Africa's own agency. So whether that comes to human rights, whether that comes to development, whichever areas have you, I would say that it is a positive development at the end of the day. And China has given Africa another option. For a long time, you know, Africa has been the little kid on the block. And finally, we're kind of getting a seat at the table, some would argue. And I would agree with that. So I think it's positive.
Cool.
Yeah, I would also agree. For Africa, it's positive. For China, I think it doesn't really matter in the big picture, because for Africa...
Really? Why?
I think it does.
Wait, I first do the African same part, then I explain my China part. I think for Africa, as you said, it's put Africa back on the picture. We have now this new scramble for Africa, which is not the colonial-style scramble we knew back then, but it's a bit more even out. So Africa has a say in it. They can choose their partner. They not just get colonized by whoever is there first, but they have some options. And we see from some Western powers that there is... they get afraid that they lose a seat at the table, so to say, and they're trying to also strengthen their relationship with certain African countries. So to my second part, I think if we look at the numbers, just at the numbers, Africa doesn't play a role for China. So in China, nothing much would change if
Do you
Africa
think President Xi Jinping
tomorrow.
would agree?
I think President Xi Jinping doesn't really, Africa is for him, most actors that deal with Africa, they do it without even Xi Jinping thinking a single thought about it. And then, of course, he goes there once a year and he holds some speeches and whatever, but
how about the political strategy to have lots of countries as friends?
Of
to
course,
be powerful in the United Nations.
There's other countries outside of Africa. They could also make what they do now, friends in South America and Latin America. They could do friends in the Pacific. So there's other friends out there. So they don't need African friends. They have, sure. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing for China, but I think it's on the scale, like what we're looking at for China, this is not one of the major issues for China, for Chinese politics, it's more or less the same as like when we're looking at European politics.
So is it more like seed money?
Pardon?
Like seed money, like startup money, like investing in a thing where they don't know what's
Africa,
coming out?
If we're looking at the global picture, it makes sense to engage with Africa, for sure. Yeah, and it's now they have it's a playground for the military, which is fine. They can get some experience with combat missions, things like that. But it's not if tomorrow, all Africa would stop dealing with China. In China, the impact would be really, really small. There's some resources missing here, but they could get that from somewhere else. So it's not it's a very uneven relationship.
So why they're doing this then?
Because, they can. It's, if we look at the money they spend on Africa, it's insignificant. It's really
compared to what?
Compared to the money they spend everywhere else in the world.
They trade more with Hong Kong, 300 billion annually, than they do with the entire African continent, which is today, the trade stands at about 200 billion. But the number is growing and there's a lot of room for improvement. But definitely, China is situated at the low end of the investment and the trading partnership. China, the lion's share of Chinese outward FDI, foreign investment and trade goes to Southeast Asia. And essentially all that goes through Hong Kong. A lot of it goes through Hong Kong. So yeah, definitely I would agree. In terms of in economic and financial and commercial terms, it's quite insignificant, but I would...
So is it good or bad for China?
Well, I don't think that's the right question we should ask. I think we need to take a step back and say what is actually going on. This is what we're jumping the gun. What is going on? This is what I was referring to in terms of the false dualisms. We've had a lot of people give us an answer to a question that we don't understand. Because who is engaging in this relationship? Is it the state? Is it Xi Jinping and then domestic governments? Or is it the subsectors? These social segments in society? Is it industries, certain sectors? Is it individuals, who have nothing to do with the government? I think the story is a lot more complex, and what we're seeing with a lot of the China-Africa commentary, at least in the last 10 years, are people sort of really eager to answer this very normative question, is it good or bad? But we don't even know what's actually going on. We don't have the data. We haven't gone into the field. A few of us have. I think people here on this panel have. But I can assure you that despite this phenomenal attention, I've been working in this field like you since before it became a thing. And it's attracted a lot of attention from the media, from politics, from policymakers, within academia. But it's actually based on very, very scant empirical evidence. We just do not have the data, quite simply. People are not going into these are very, very difficult spaces to do field work in. China will not give you access. The private companies, the state-owned companies will not give you access to what they're doing.
But why
individual countries are not collecting the data.
Why it's generating so much interest if it's not so important for China?
No, hang on. So there's two things. So I just wanted to say, I think whether it's good or bad, first of all, we need to ask for whom. If you really insist on asking this question,
I do.
Fine. So let's ask it, but then let's say for whom, because behind that question is actually a footnote. And what we in Europe want to know is it good or bad for us? We do not care if it's good or bad for Africans, because we don't even know which countries actually lie in Africa. We don't know anything about your African history. We don't know anything about our own European colonial history. I can tell you, I grew up in Britain and France, I live in Belgium, I had a German partner. They don't know anything about their colonial history. So it's not about Africa at all, and it's certainly not about China. It's what does that imply for Europe? What does that imply for us? So that's what's really behind this question, is it good or bad? So that's why I want to really invite you to deconstruct it, to really challenge it and say, okay, so who are we talking about? Who is it good and bad for? Who are the actors? What are they involved? What instruments and channels are they using? So for example, when we're talking about, these relationships, are we talking about bilateral relations, which is specifically a diplomatic channel, and these are old institutions that make the kind of, the global international system function? Or is it investment? And investment works in an entirely different way. Or is it lending? Is it debt? Because actually what's going on in China, in what China is doing, it's become a huge investor in Africa, not definitely insignificant numbers if you compare, as I mentioned, to Hong Kong.
You're raising lots of questions.
Yeah, but it's very important because we're giving answers to something we don't understand. So let's be very clear. China's become more of a lender to Africa than it is an investor.
So is it, for example, is it a debt trap? If China is investing in Africa, that's one of...
So investment and debt is different, okay? Investment means you acquire the asset. Okay, This is why we need to be very technical, okay? It's not that complicated. If I invest in this land or in this asset, it's mine because I invested in it. I can invest up to a share of 10% or 100%, but that's mine. A loan is different. This is your asset. You need to develop it. You need 100 million to develop it. I will give you that 100 million. So it's not the same thing.
So how does it work in Africa?
Well, there's both.
Okay.
And there's both when they're two very different things. So one is loan, one is debt, and one is investment. So two very different things. And then, you have the state-owned companies who are doing specific kinds of very strategic investments in extractive industries, primarily, in my opinion, to forward a geostrategic agenda, which is about cultivating geopolitical alliances. And I think actually it's fundamental to China to have these African friends. Yes, if Africa disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. But Africa was critical in getting the PRC recognized as a permanent member of the Security Council in 1971. China depended almost 80% on the African votes of these newly independent countries in order to replace Taiwan as the official member of the UN Permanent Security Council. So these are very, very important, institutions. And if China wants to have weight, it's very intelligent. It's not saying Africa is important, but the relationship with the global South in general has been a key instrument or an interface through which China has strategically positioned itself within this shifting international system.
This is also, I think, what I was going to say in terms of Africa. I get what George was saying in terms of the numbers game. Africa might not be important, but Africa still remains a battleground then for Chinese or Eastern and Western interests. So in that sense, it is very important for China in terms of its dealings with Africa, because that also signals a certain kind of assertion of power or whatever have you vis-a-vis the West.
Is Africa just a tool for China to gain more power in on the world level?
I think it's a tool, but I don't think it's the only thing.
Are they interested? Is China interested in Africa?
I don't know that China is interested in Africa in that kind of normative way, but I don't think that that's important. From an African perspective, I'm South African, so this is how I think about it. For me, it's, you know, how can we in Africa leverage the opportunities that we get from China? So whether or not China engages in Africa for altruistic reasons, and this relates to my research of human rights, where one of the chapters in my book is titled, you know, is a human right by any other name a human right? So if the end result is benefit to the people, and if the end result is development on a broad-based scale, does it matter if it's termed human rights? Does it matter that China goes in and waves a flag that this is a human rights-oriented policy in the way that Europe would do that? I don't think it matters. I think at the end of the day, it's the end user that is the core issue, and that's what we need to focus on is, are these relations, are they beneficial to the end user? And a lot of times I think part of the complication is that it's still too early to tell. So I think in a lot of China, you know, as much as we can bring up, you know, the empirical facts and this and that, a lot of it is very, you know, we just haven't seen it yet. And then on the other hand, as much as empirical facts are important, there are a lot of normative and conceptual issues. And I think a lot of the times in the China-Africa field, we got caught up in the empiricism of it all, right? And facts and numbers. But I think the conceptual focus is also something that tends to be lacking, and that's what I try to do in my work, is really to understand, okay, so what do we mean by development? What do we mean by the state? The state does not look like the Western state. What does foreign policy or conditionality entail, and how does that bring about good governance? How does it bring about human dignity? What do we mean when we say these things?
How can Africans leverage their position in dealing with China? You raised this question.
Well, we first need China strategies, which is something that is, you know, tends to be missing. I don't think.
Why it's missing?
I don't think we've taken it seriously enough. I can only speak from South Africa's perspective. I don't think African governments, South Africa has taken it seriously enough, particularly, at least not in a public forum.
But I mean, South Africa is one of the few countries that actually have a strategy. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think there's a few countries that play the cards rather well. Pardon?
How about East Africa? Kenya, Ethiopia, do they have a
some
strategy?
do, some don't. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, there's a lot of different countries there, and some are. I mean, for instance, Rwanda is also. I think they're playing their cards quite well. Kagame is a very powerful leader, and he tells the Chinese, "We want this and this and that." Yeah?
Mostly to localize, to
whatever. I mean, he has a clear agenda what he wants from China, and China is responsive to the demands they get from Africa. This is something. But the problem is not. I mean, the problem is not on the Chinese side. The problem is that there is no demands from Africa. Yes. I mean, for instance, sometimes, when we look how this policy works, I mean, there's this group of African ambassadors in Beijing, yeah, and some of them are totally not attached anymore to their home country. So they're just like, yeah, maybe, what do we need back home? Maybe a school. A school would be really good. And then Beijing goes there and builds a school, and then local governments, or even the national government say, we never said we want to have a school. And why you are going to build us a school? And they said, yeah, your ambassador told us. And this is actually happening. So the problem is not that China is like something pushing their agenda to Africa. The problem is there's nothing coming from Africa. Africa is not, I mean, Africa, if they would, what you said, they had a clear strategy, a policy, they could play their hand so much better, but they don't do that. And this is, I mean, we see something.
Could and should we have?
Some countries,
yeah.
Like a very, some exceptions are like Ethiopia, Rwanda, that you mentioned to some extent. And this is really about...
Why are they an exception?
Because they're just better at statecraft, simply said. They're just better at statecraft. They understand the game, les grands enjeux that we say, in French. They understand basically what the big issues are. okay? And they understand where they have to hit, okay? And they understand power moves. And they look at simply how other countries modernized, and China's miracle is not really a miracle. It just really kind of followed a simple blueprint. So the Dong reform, is just, it's a lesson in classic modernization theory where they put all their emphasis on exports, manufacturing, and construction. They overinvested heavily, and it led to a lot of structural imbalances. But essentially what they're doing was building a manufacturing base which is labor intensive. What you do is you pull in, you have to look at your demographic dividend. Look, economic development is about a few simple things. I mean, it seems complicated, but it's about your geography and it's about your demography. And of course, it's also about historical political timing. And luckily, China had all three, and they did excellent policy sequencing under Deng Xiaoping. They had the good political timing, they had a huge demographic dividend which they could rely on in order to really kind of take off and use their manufacturing base. And that's what they did, and essentially Ethiopia is just basically ripping a page out of the Chinese book. That's what they've done. China is now going to Africa and saying, we're looking for countries that look like what we did in the 1980s, which means having a large pool of disposable, cheap, low-educated labor that you can use in low-end manufacturing, for example, because you do not have the technology and the capability to do high-tech stuff, and you do not have the capital. So you depend on outward investment that's coming in to transfer the technology. You employ your labor force that is big. You have gradual spillover effects. You export out. You start to accumulate savings, and then you spill that over into, well, hopefully you have a strong, what we call a distribution mechanism, which then spreads this wealth out so that other sectors of your economy can
does it work?
Well, look what happened to China. Of course, you can say it's had imbalances. Let me just give you a couple of numbers. In let's say 1979 or 1980, I don't know the audience, what was the population of China that was living under $1 a day? Percentage-wise?
Lots.
70? Anyone else? But in percentage of the total population? Over 95% was living under. So at the time, those were kind of the standards of poverty, under $1 a day. Okay, 3 decades later, Xi Jinping, what is the population of Chinese people living under poverty? The same, let's say roughly the same benchmark. It's about $2 now a day. Less than 10%, maybe even less than 5%, depending on your statistics. So what you had was a very, very sharp pyramid of wealth like this for decades, which within 3 generations, China turned like this. That's over 1 billion people. So you're lifting, I would argue that Chinese lifted themselves out of poverty, of course, given a good, conditions. But this is, so it does work.
But it doesn't work in Africa.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a whole other issue.
In Africa?
No,
possible?
I don't think so.
It's a whole other issue, absolutely.
Why?
Because there's a different. China had quite a good, as you said, statecraft. They streamlined this into more development. They kind of started to source out, they built up their industry, there was some clever investments, all that. This is not happening. This is not happening in Ethiopia. What we see in Ethiopia so far is Chinese businessmen go there, they build up big sweatshops, and they employ people for minimum wage, which is
But that's
low.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what happened. I agree.
Actually, this is what the Germans did when they started the car industry in the 80s
Absolutely.
in China.
Yeah. And that's what we
story.
We delocalized to Romania, and now the Romanians are cheap labor.
The difference is, if we're looking at the Ethiopian state, now we will see, because in the last year something has changed in Ethiopia. But before that, what happened? All the capital that was accumulated in Ethiopia, went to very few pockets and mostly outside of Africa. It was invested in some big palaces in Paris or wherever. In Ethiopia, I'm not sure, they're not going to Paris, but so this is a problem that it's an African problem. Yeah, we don't have in Africa. We don't have like any. But please, Stacey.
This is what I would say, is that look, we're mentioning statecraft, and statecraft obviously plays a key role here. Whether we take the European example, whether we take the China example. I'm just thinking, as Solange was speaking, I was thinking, you give me a lot of time to think. Thanks. But no, you know, in China, the state system is it's endogenous, right? It's a system that was created organically within the Chinese society. In Europe, you have the same thing. Statecraft was a local organic development. In Africa, that's not the case. So when you point to Africa as or African statecraft as the issue, I agree with that, but the reason why it's an issue is because that has never been embedded within the social fabric of Africa itself.
Yeah, but
why?
And so
Why?
In China, we're talking now hardcore capitalism here. There was never, we switched from Mao over Deng to hardcore capitalism. This was also imposed to them. So they learned, it's our rules, and they just learned to play after our rules better than we do. And this is the problem in Africa. There is not of course I know all the problems and the cultural explanations, and of course, there is a lot of very good reasons why it's not working. But the fact remains, it is not working. The reasons, sure. There's a lot, of course, the colonialism and all these historic explanations, and definitely.
So
the problem is still, it's not
Is it
working.
not working, or could it work?
Sorry, I want to bring it back to numbers again. Sorry, I want to bring it back to facts because it's really important, because China really attracted a lot of investment overseas. So it's like everything, you need a certain threshold to get things going, okay? And the sweatshops that you're describing in Ethiopia, the Chinese shoe factories, are delocalizing and opening there. That's, as you said, that's what Germany had, that's what China had. We're talking about really squeezing your value, your profit to the worker. Absolutely, this is kind of what happened everywhere. But just to give you an idea of how desperate the continent is for cash, the UN released a World Investment Report in April. I think UNCTAD just produced it. And Africa, the number of total FDI global flows that goes to Africa is less than 3% of global FDI flows. Over 50% goes to the developed world, 30% I think goes to Asia, and 10% goes to Latin America and the Caribbean. So Africa really is at the bottom of the FDI food chain. And this is investment, this is not debt, okay? This is just pure investment where people see that there's a potential for future growth. So that just gives you an idea of, even if the Chinese are delocalizing their factories because they're playing the globalization game, and even if money is going in there, it's not enough. It's just simply not enough. There's not what we call, a critical mass of amount of money that is going in that is enough to really kickstart a sustainable form of growth. Again, it's a bit technical, but it's just to give you an idea of how important it is. China is investing in infrastructure, it's investing in extractive, it's investing in resources and commodities, but it's just never enough. They're not going to change the development equation of Africa. That's not what they're doing. And if you ask me, I would definitely say China would not do that. That isn't.
Stacey, do you agree? No change in Africa?
No.
Because of the Chinese investment?
No, I would I would disagree, because I do think that China has potentially kickstarted something. Yeah. And so whether we see change in development immediately or whether that change comes over time, which I think it's still, again, it's a long haul game. So I don't think we can say that in 5 years' time we'll know. But I do think that it's changing, again, just in terms of how Africa also sees itself and how Africa is starting to realize that we need to play a strategic game ourselves. We cannot, there's no point that China, gives all these opportunities and we let them go to waste. Populations are also seeing this and are also wanting to hold their governments accountable to that to a certain degree. So I do think that there is a change happening, albeit not as fast or as quick as we expect it to. And there are various reasons for that. And I don't think it's only to do with the weakness of African governments and the weakness of policy. I think it's a long haul game, and I think that it's going to take a number of factors for it truly to become beneficial to Africa.
Would it be possible that the Europeans, the British, the Germans, the French, help Africans to find a strategy against China?
They've been trying to do that for 60 years. It hasn't worked.
Just a fact, and the US just published a new African policy. The country that is mentioned most in this African policy is actually China, which is mentioned 16 times. South Sudan comes 5 times. It's an African policy of the United States. it's an anti-China policy, basically. So this is not, and Africa, I mean, they could profit from it, again, if they would know how to play their
So
cards.
what would be our role as Europeans in Africa? Do you miss us?
Again, who's you?
Stacey?
I don't, look, I think the role for Europe needs to do a lot of introspection itself. I just I was at a talk about the Dutch-China strategy that has now been released. And again, you know, it's framed in this China threat kind of way. It tries very much to be nuanced and all of this. But again, Africa is mentioned a lot. Human rights are mentioned a lot. And I think when it comes to it, I think Europe and the US, the West in general, needs to realize that their role is diminishing. And that's a tough pill to swallow when you've been on top for such a long time.
But we could join forces with Africa?
I don't
You never left
think
Africa. You never left.
trusts Europe in the way that Europe would like to see itself.
Why not?
Well,
I mean, maybe just one example.
Yes.
Kagame was in Brussels last week, and he gave a very interesting interview because he was criticized by the European Union. There was a human rights report from Rwanda, and he was heavily criticized. And he said, and that was a very look at the European border policy. We letting people drown in the Mediterranean Sea. And this is exactly the same European Union that is lecturing us who fought against genocide and he freed Rwanda about human rights. And this is stuff where, of course, the European Union, I mean, they cannot be the moral counterpart to China. They lost that position. So on an economic footing, they can also not compete with China and Africa because, I mean, China is now the biggest investor in most countries.
So is there no more moral counterpart to China?
Why there has to be a moral counterpart?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, China is not doing, I mean, China did, and this is also maybe a cliche, China did a lot of not very positive things in the past, and they're still doing some not very positive things
That's
now. But
very diplomatic.
This is not more like, this is basically the same that everyone else does, just with China. It's always associated with China. I mean, if I would say now, for instance, the Swiss are exploiting people in Zambia, you would all say, why the Swiss? Because Glencore is the biggest resource company in Zambia, and it's a Swiss company. So, but you would never blame the Swiss. We don't blame the Dutch for what is Shell, I think, is a Dutch company. What Shell is doing in Nigeria, we don't blame them. But we blame the Chinese if one single Chinese trader is exploiting some guy in an Ethiopian market. It's the Chinese. So this is the problem, that there's so many different players and levels.
So we should then stop blaming anyone?
we should stop speaking about China as if it's one homogenous kind of player. And I think you see this, and this is what Solange said earlier. You know, there's so many actors, there's so many levels of engagement, units of analysis, and you know, for those actually interested in China-Africa relations, I think it's so important, especially if you do research, to be specific about, you know, not referring to China just, you know, out there in the air. I think the biggest challenge is to get media on board to kind of not perpetuate these kind of narratives and this kind of stereotype. But it doesn't help that policymakers themselves in the European Union are speaking about China as if it's one homogenous actor. It doesn't help that the United States is speaking about China in this way. Mm-hmm. So I think we're caught between being extremely nuanced and obviously a political game that's being played here.
But is it smart to give up the universal human rights?
But you don't have to do that.
I don't think it's giving it up whatsoever. I don't think you're giving up universal human rights whatsoever. I mean, universal human rights, you have civil and political rights, you have socio-economic rights, you have cultural, you have the right to development. So human rights, this is the other thing, is, you know, people have adopted the Western notion of human rights, which generally focuses only on civil and political rights. But there are other human rights that are as equal to civil and political rights. And so if we look at the international legal framework, we have to understand that human rights are not just about democracy, that human rights are not just a prescription in terms of ideological or political framework. It's far, far more than that. And I think that is missing in the discussion right now.
Why no one is discussing this?
Well, they are.
It's not in the interest of the West to discuss this.
Yeah, also, definitely.
Why not?
The West doesn't care about Africa. And that's now coming to the table, and that's now, they're...
Does China cares more about Africa than the Western
well,
countries?
it's a win-win, right? The West pretends to do this in this altruistic way of, we're not gaining anything from this, but we just want to better you guys. We've all known that's the biggest load of BS for the longest time. China does not profess to do that. They say this is win-win. They are not professing to be purely altruistic in their engagement with Africa. And I think that kind of approach is recognized as much more as genuine, as much as people would maybe be shocked to hear that, but it's seen as much more transparent than what the West has actually been.
Just to bounce directly off that, I mean, to come back to the issue of what can Europe do in Africa, well, when you see this map, what are the first ideas that come up? I mean, essentially, if you talk about Africa and Europe today, it means several things, probably two things: migration, i.e. crisis, and famine or instability, i.e. crisis. So for Europe, Africa's a problem. It's simple. If you say Africa to China, it's business. An African is a client. He's not a refugee. He's not a scrounging off public funds. He's not someone I should be afraid of. He's not harboring terrorism. He's someone I'm going to do business with. And this is the difference in perspective. And Africans feel that. They definitely feel that they're not just being given handouts. I mean, you say, can Europe do something about it? They have. They've just spent 60 years building basically a neo-colonial legacy of dependency in this very, very unequal trade system, where they basically locked the South in terrible, unequal terms. If Europe wants to do something, invest. But invest in
Cancel
what we call
debt.
invest in sustainable industries. So you're talking about Glencore. Actually, Europe invests more than China in Africa, okay? China is the biggest trader of the continent, and it's rising in terms of lending debt. But actually, in terms of investment, the Dutch, the French, the British, if you take Europe as a whole, actually invests a lot more, and the US invests a lot more. But look at the structure of their investments. European and American and Australian and Canadian investments are in fixed assets, and they're in fixed assets in specific industries, commodities and resources. What does that mean? You have enclaves in the continent where raw material is being sucked out and pumped out of what we call these evacuation channels and brought into the West where they're recycled. So there's no added value that's being produced on the ground. All you're doing is generating bad jobs, mining unskilled jobs. And you're not giving them an opportunity to scale up. You're not giving these people an opportunity to learn how to industrialize. That doesn't happen through extractive industries. That happens through manufacturing. That happens through a different kind of political sequences. It happens through modernizing their agriculture. And none of this is happening. So if Europe wants to do that, diversify your investment portfolio in Africa, be a stakeholder in Africa, but be an intelligent, responsible stakeholder. Invest better. Glencore is the devil on the continent. I would 100% agree. If you look at these big, KCM, Vedanta, Indian companies, Canadian companies, Australian companies, basically these huge operators that have these, what we call, these extractive enclaves all around the world, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Papua New Guinea, they operate according to the same principles. Then diversify your investment. Invest in agriculture, which is what the Chinese are doing. Invest in manufacturing. Invest in ways that the country can structurally benefit.
At least one.
Why they don't do it?
Because they don't see them as customers. There's no hope. How does money work? How does the economy work? Money, the economy works as if I believe that there's a hope, that there's a potential future, then I'll do business with you. But if you're just a peasant who still lives on subsistence agriculture and who can't do anything better but to, plant maize, why should I invest in you?
I think this is also different. I mean, China is there to make money. definitely. But they also have political motives. So there's some really nice research being done. For instance, when we're looking at Glencore and Chinese mining companies, and when the prices for copper, which is the main resource in Zambia, when it's dropping, the first who fire laborers are not the Chinese, but the Western companies. Because the Chinese, they play a longer game.
Yes.
And they have, of course, it's because a lot of it is state-owned companies and they have more money and they don't have these fixed profit targets like, okay, in 6 months, in 1 year, you have to be profitable, otherwise we withdraw or something or you get fired. They have longer strategies, longer planning, and they have a bit more resources when they are from state-owned enterprises. So when we're looking at employment, despite all the negative facts that are there, there's also examples where actually Chinese have the more, or Chinese companies, or Chinese SAOEs, or whoever, have the more human strategy, I would say.
Are they forced by the government to act in this way?
There is a geopolitical agenda behind this, okay? In Zambia, very
Because
specifically...
normally enterprises, they don't have a geopolitical agenda. They
No.
just want to make money.
And this is a great opportunity to make a very important distinction between what I would call geostrategic Chinese state investment, and then profit-driven Chinese state investment. Okay, there's Chinese state investment, but it happens in this two-tier system. I'm simplifying it, okay? And this one that you're specifically talking about, the mining, this is really about nurturing a long-term geopolitical alliance, which means when the mines shut down after the crisis in 2008 and they were firing tons of people were even selling off their assets. They were saying they were closing the mines. Chinese kept their mines open, and they even bought out the mines that people were selling. Yeah, so they're the long-term investors. But that's because, and they're ready to make this economic compromise because they have these long credit chains, of course, these credit lines, but because there's that hard geopolitical agenda behind it. Now, the SOEs, the Chinese state-owned enterprises that are purely profit-driven, so who look a little bit more like Glencore. Glencore are these big multinational companies which are shareholder-driven. So the companies belong to the shareholders, and shareholders just want to make money and want to see dividends. You know, and actually Chinese profit-driven companies look a little bit more like Glencore. They are profit-driven, and they need to make money as well. So you have to also make that distinction between these very important geostrategic Chinese state-owned companies, which are, I would say, the minority, like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, for example, or the ZCCM's mining case in Zambia. And then you have like a whole battery of profit-driven Chinese SOEs, and they are really acting, it's dog-eat-dog world. They're playing by the market rules.
Do you agree, Stacey?
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think in terms of profit versus the geostrategic or the geopolitical, I think another factor or another issue that might factor in is, again, the international geopolitical game, so to speak. So in that sense, I think China does try to differentiate itself to a certain degree from the way the West would engage in Africa. That goes back to the question of, do the Chinese actually engage in a very distinct way, or is it something that is comparable to the West? And I think it depends on what you're looking at. It depends on whether you're looking at SOEs or whether you're looking at the other forms of engagement. So that's what I would say on that.
Is the Chinese involvement in Africa a model for the development of the world?
Of the world.
Yes, of other areas?
Definitely not, and the Chinese would be the first to say it.
Yeah,
Chinese would be like, don't do what we're doing, because we have no idea what we're doing.
Chinese are saying.
You know, Chinese people do first and they think later.
Yeah.
Really? They do first and
good?
they think later. It's not about whether it's good or not. That's just their modus operandi. Yeah? And you hear that a lot as well on the African side. I've interviewed tons of African leaders, including presidents and ambassadors and ministers, and they tell me, you know, when we're in meetings with these white people from Europe, and it's this and that and what, and they'll talk for ages in meetings, and you have to do this, and you have just get going. Start doing something.
Well, Europe is, all talk in a lot of senses, and China isn't. China acts, and we'll clean up the mess afterwards as we go along, and we'll repair here and there, and
Georg, now it's your turn to defend Europe.
Yeah, no. I would say Europe, we set a model how to deal with these states. And the states got very used to this kind of model. And this is also when we're talking about the debt trap, this is the problem. Because they now slowly realize that China is not this traditional donor country that goes there and make some investment, and if it doesn't turn out, then okay, there's a World Bank that jumps in and bail you out and all this kind of thing. China is there, as we mentioned a lot of times, to make money. And now I think this is the problem, that a lot of African leaders, they're not used to this different style. They're still thinking as aid, in this aid terms, in this ODA terms. And this is something China has a total different framing. I mean, there's some positive things like win-win, but they also would never talk of aid. They would say it's an investment. Yeah. An investment has to have a return, as we all...
Or a loan.
A loan,
yes.
I'm sorry, she's the expert for the... No, but for a loan, there has to be a return. Yes. And this is a very different style of investing, engaging with Africa. And I think this is the problem, a little bit the problem with Europe. Because, I mean, of course, the European model is more altruistic. It's a bit... I mean, when we look at the history where it comes back from the 50s, I think when it started out, there were for sure some people who had really, really good intentions with it. But what happened is now that a lot of leaders in Africa, a lot of elites in Africa, they're so used to that this form of donating money, and then of course they're trying to get some of it on the side in their own pockets, and this is now there's a different style, and I think now I hope that some African countries will learn to deal with that style, because if they do, I think there's a real win-win. At the moment, I don't really see it.
There's not only China investing in Africa, but on the southern hemisphere there are other countries. There's India investing a lot. There's Japan investing a lot. You don't want to talk about those countries. They don't matter.
I mean, Japan was... Sorry.
No, go.
Okay. I mean, Japan is part of this traditional donor group.
They're
donors.
They're
giving aid, they're building schools.
Practically, they're a Western country.
Japan is definitely. I mean, they're part of the DAC, and they're 100%.
How about India? More hope from India?
India is not doing much.
There's no serious investing.
Again, I mean, when we look at India, I mean, there's been on a policy level, I think there's been now some mirroring of also Russia is now. I think Russia will be the next big player after China, but it will take some years. But there's been a mirroring if we're looking at for instance, we have this FOCAC, which we still haven't really explained, but which is the Forum of Chinese-African Cooperation, which is the main dialogue forum between China and African countries. And we see this kind of thing mirrored by more and more new new emerging countries like Russia, like India. But if we're looking at the numbers, there's none of them even combined, they don't even compare to China.
But I also think, on a more ideological level, these newer actors don't present as an attractive an option for Africa. So let alone that.
Why?
Well, China's something new.
There's no vision.
India is still poor.
There's no vision.
India.
China made it, but India doesn't.
Exactly.
So how can, I mean, what is India for an example?
So to bounce on the India, one measure to classic measuring stick to see how developed a country is as looking at the portion of landlords, property owners in the world. So I think Germany is actually quite on the low level in Europe, comparatively speaking. I think China has probably one of the highest rates of private property ownership on the planet today. Like the large majority of the population owns their property. There are more landlords in China than there are people who have access to a toilet in India. This is a very, very important comparison because it really says a lot about these two different countries and these two different models. So you can shout all day long about India being the largest democracy in the world, but what is that human rights and that democracy worth when your population doesn't even have hygienic access to the toilet? And I think this is really the point that Stacey wants to drive home, and it's critical, So that's what we're interested in, We're being gaslighted into thinking that these, civic rights are the most important, and that's what China would argue. Listen, I'm not a China lover or whatever, I'm just looking at the facts. I think there's a lot of problematic things that are China doing, both in China and outside of China. But, China says people also have fundamental access to basic goods. I think it'll become more problematic as they rise up, what we call this kind of, this material pyramid, and Chinese people will want more and more goods, and it'll move to more political rights eventually, which you could say to some extent India has, but this is a really fundamental difference with India. So I don't see India as being a major issue in Africa at all. And good for Africa. If they've got more people interested in them, good for them. If China's arrival has meant that everyone is now hit reset and are going to reprogram the way that they operate with them, well, good for them. People are going to start talking investment, people are going to start talking money, and none of this donor rubbish that is completely outdated. Russia has never left Africa. Okay, Russia has been in Africa since the Cold War. Africa is critical to Russian security. It has been supplying weapons and military training and terrorist training, maybe that's too strong a word, to African governments for decades. It's never left. They've been very, very under the radar. Moscow has played its cards very differently, but it's definitely around. Moscow, trust me, the Russians are around.
Does Beijing have any military interest in Africa? They just opened a military base in Djibouti,
no.
Nearly like everyone.
Support facility.
Yeah.
Again, terms.
With a supercomputer.
It's not a military base. Yeah. Any Chinese would definitely, it's a military base, of course.
Yes.
But it is not. It's a support facility. And this is a big difference. I mean, as
for
I said,
me, it's not a big difference, actually.
No, but for China, it is.
For official...
they will actually, I think they will pretty soon we'll see the second military base in Namibia, which they just started to discuss. No, I think, they don't have per se military interests. What they have assets in Africa, and they have to protect these assets. They have citizens in Africa, and they have to protect these citizens. And another thing, there is Africa as well.
I heard this from the Americans as well, that they want to protect their citizens all over the world.
Yeah, but I think it's a bit
about the assets first.
This doesn't sound new to me.
No, but I think it's also big because China is projecting security to its citizens everywhere in the world. US isn't really doing that. Yeah.
Really? They would.
No, if an American gets, it's a big deal. Okay, it's different. Let's say if Americans got kidnapped somewhere by some Islamic terrorists, in some African state, it wouldn't really instantly fall back on the American government. First, they were stupid, they were running around in Congo, and what they were doing there might be, maybe it would, yeah? In China, it's different. I think in China, because China promised their citizens they are safe, yeah? So China has also this, but I think this is for security in Africa, this is really not the main reason. It's assets, it's assets, it's citizens, and it's global norms. In Africa, this is where, when we're looking about, for instance, intervention in other countries, responsibility to protect all these big talks. This is Africa as a place where that happens. And China want to be part of that. China has a huge interest to determine what are, for instance, the conditions how a country can intervene in another country in case of human crisis.
But isn't this only the first step? They say they want to protect their citizens. Now their military is not strong enough. 10, 15 years later, their military is strong enough, and then they act the same way than the Americans?
No, of course, in Africa, what they also get, I just said it, it's the first time for the PLA since 1979 that was in any active combat missions in Africa. They're completely unexperienced. They have trainings, of course, but they're completely unexperienced with real conflicts. And they learn that in Africa, and they know they learn that.
And in Russia.
Again, we have to see there's different, is it the different actors? It's the PLA, there are some people in the PLA, they definitely push for, in the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, they're pushing for engaging more in China. There's some traditional politicians who say, no, it's non-interference. It's a core principle of Chinese foreign policy. We don't interfere in other countries. Then the military guys say, but we have to learn, how to fight, how to employ our troops, and where we can learn that is in Africa, because if they would start doing these things somewhere in the Pacific.
So good luck Africa, if they use Africa to learn how to fight.
They've got military drills with the Russians.
Drills.
The drills.
They actually fight.
That's
a big difference. Drills they can have all day long.
Yeah, but he's absolutely right. The Chinese, absolutely right. The Chinese military has absolutely no combat experience this generation, and that's very different if you compare it to a very active military force like the US.
They do need some.
I think you need some, yeah, but China's actually doing it a lot through the Blue Helmet contribution. So it has basically humanitarian aid. So it's contributed blue helmets to, for example, Mozambique, the humanitarian crisis. So it's got, a few pockets of activities there, but it has to be kind of a non-conflictual, non-warlike context. But I would agree that. Listen, there are two. There are two issues behind your question. The point is, will it want to extend, its strategic military power bases across the world, be they on land or on sea? Of course it will. Of course that's its intention. Any rising power that has been historically poor and weak, and in a kind of a victim position, which is what China perceives itself to have been, of course it will expand. It wants to multiply and expand its options. Is it doing that expansion for defensive rather than offensive purposes is a whole other issue, and what is it going to do? Is it going to set up like a ring of ballistic missiles, right outside America's door? I don't think so. It's not because China has what we call these huge warships now, on the sea that they're ready to point their guns at anybody. So is it a defensive strategy? Offensive? But look, when you're talking about geopolitics, geography is key, and any power will want to defend its security. It just depends on how you want to define national security. I would actually argue that China has its top security issues is domestic, and it's keeping things at home under control. That is really its number one priority, staying in power, and that will happen through enhancing the legitimacy of the party and enhancing the efficacy of the party. But its real issues are at home. They're not in Djibouti, they're not in America, they're not even in the Pacific. I would say the second order of importance for Chinese security is what we call kind of the greater China region, which is Hong Kong and Taiwan, and to a lesser extent Macau. But that is China's second order national security agenda. And it will do quite a lot to protect those things. And that's why we're seeing all this tension building around Hong Kong at the moment with the demonstrations that are taking place. And only after those two huge items on China's agenda does it really start thinking about global security. So this is just to give you some sort of perspective, I think, on where China fits.
Stacey, are you in any ways afraid of China?
No. I don't have much to say on the military or, defense kind of aspect, but
otherwise?
No, for me...
do you feel neo-colonized?
Nope, not whatsoever. If anything, I am very grateful for a more multipolar world as opposed to what we have now in terms of unipolarity, and I think the shift... Look, if the pendulum shifts from one end to the other, that's a different question. But I think that where it will end will be somewhere in the middle. So I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of person. So I'm optimistic.
Cool.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and thank you to all panelists for this great insight.